It started the moment we crossed the border into North Carolina, heading into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. My friends, Mike and Jenna, and I were supposed to be on a simple fall weekend trip, just a few days away from our lives in Atlanta, away from phones, emails, and traffic. The cabin we rented was tucked deep in a hollow outside Boone, accessible only by a narrow, twisting gravel road. The drive alone felt like leaving the world behind. By the time we crested the last ridge, the sun was just touching the tops of the trees, painting the mountains in fiery reds and golds. The cabin looked like something out of a postcard, small, rustic, a wide porch that wrapped around one side, and a chimney with smoke curling lazily into the evening sky. When we stepped out of the truck, the air smelled crisp and sharp, filled with pine and damp leaves. Jenna immediately went to the porch swing and sat staring at the trees. Mike and I carried in the bags, joking about being back to nature, as if we weren't already shivering slightly in the cool twilight. Inside, the cabin was simple: a main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchenette, and a loft above with a single bed and a futon. Electricity worked barely, and there was no cell signal. That was fine. We all needed a break. That first night, after unpacking and making a simple dinner, we sat on the porch with a few beers, listening to the quiet. The silence was different from what we were used to in the city. It was heavier, like the air itself was thick and listening. Jenna commented on it, joking nervously that it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I laughed, but even I felt uneasy. Around 10, I went inside to grab another beer, and that's when I first noticed the sound, a faint snapping of twigs just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was an animal, probably a deer. But the sound came again, heavier this time, deliberate, like someone was walking slowly on purpose. My skin prickled. The next morning, we decided to hike a trail behind the cabin. The path was narrow and overgrown, twisting between the thick trees. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was our boots crunching on the forest floor. We passed a creek and paused to fill our water bottles, noticing the moss-covered stones along the bank. The forest felt different, older somehow, like it had been waiting. It was on that hike we came across the first clearing. At first, it seemed ordinary, just an opening in the trees. But then we saw it, a circle of stones arranged meticulously on the ground. Each stone was smooth, round, about the size of a basketball, and stacked in small pyramids. There were no footprints, no fire remnants, nothing to indicate recent human activity. Just the stones arranged as if someone or something had built them intentionally. Mike laughed nervously, saying it was probably some old logging ritual or some local kid's prank. But Jenna and I exchanged glances, feeling the same unease. I wanted to leave immediately, but Mike insisted we take pictures. Even as I raised the camera, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, that we weren't supposed to be there. We returned to the cabin before sunset, trying to laugh it off, but the air felt heavier. That night, the footsteps began, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. We didn't see anyone, but the crunch of gravel and breaking twigs made our stomachs tighten. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, just below the level of hearing, like someone speaking directly to the shadows. We stayed up until dawn, sitting with the lights on, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind or an animal. But neither Mike nor Jenna slept. The following day, we went on a longer hike, trying to distract ourselves. The trail led deeper into the woods, into a valley where the trees grew taller and closer together. It was colder there, damper, and the shadows felt longer. We passed another clearing, larger this time, filled with more stone circles. Some were partially overgrown, while others were perfectly intact. In the center of one, there was a pile of sticks arranged neatly, almost like a miniature raft or altar. I felt a chill run down my spine. "We need to get out of here," I said. But Mike, ever the skeptic, wanted to explore more. I followed reluctantly, my eyes scanning the forest for any movement. That's when I saw it, a figure at the edge of the clearing, pale, thin, motionless, and watching us from between the trees. I froze. Mike didn't notice, and Jenna whispered my name, snapping me out of it. By the time I looked again, it was gone. We hurried back to the cabin, our nerves frayed. That night, the footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the cabin and stopping just beyond the porch light. And then the humming started. Low, soft, and haunting, carrying a melody I couldn't recognize. It seemed to weave through the trees, surrounding us, pressing into the cabin. We sat huddled together, too scared to move, waiting for dawn. The next day, we tried to leave, but when we reached the truck, the engine wouldn't start. Nothing we tried worked. Panic set in. We realized we were trapped, at least until someone from town could help or until daylight allowed us to hike back. Over the next 24 hours, the cabin became a prison. Footsteps, whispers, and humming continued. Small piles of stones appeared on the porch and windowsills. Branches were stacked neatly near the doors. Every time we thought we saw a figure at the edge of the clearing, it vanished before we could get a good look. Our nerves frayed until every sound was unbearable. By the third night, desperation had taken over. We decided to hike out, sticking together and moving as quickly as we could along the road. But the forest seemed to shift around us. Familiar bends became unfamiliar. Landmarks we thought we recognized appeared in the wrong place. We kept going, pushing ourselves until we finally stumbled onto the main gravel road leading back toward town. When we reached civilization, the relief was immediate but hollow. None of us spoke much during the drive back. The woods, the stones, the humming, all of it stayed with us, etched into memory. Even now I can feel it sometimes. The memory of the stones arranged in perfect circles, the pale figure glimpsed at the edge of the clearing, the soft, hypnotic humming that seemed to wrap around my mind. I never returned to the Appalachian Mountains, and I don't plan to. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some things are meant to remain unseen. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes think I hear it again. The low hum, the crunch of gravel under unseen feet, and the feeling of being watched from just beyond the trees. Story the end. I remember the first time I realized there was something wrong in the Appalachian Mountains. I was 23, fresh out of college, and full of the kind of reckless confidence only someone in their early 20s can have. My plan had been simple. Rent a small cabin, disappear into the woods for the summer, write my novel, and maybe find some peace away from the city. I found a cabin advertised online, tucked away near a place called Black Hollow in western North Carolina. The pictures looked quaint: a small log cabin, a stone chimney, a porch overlooking a ridge surrounded by dense forest. The price was suspiciously low, but I told myself it was a deal for a remote summer retreat. The drive up was long and winding. The highway turned into a gravel road, which turned into nothing more than tire tracks leading through the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even more secluded than I'd expected. The trees were thick, closing in around the small clearing, and the creek I had read about in the ad gurgled nearby, cutting through the shadows of the forest. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth, and the silence was heavier than I expected. The cabin was old but sturdy. Inside, it smelled of mildew and wood smoke from a stove that hadn't been used in years. The floors creaked under every step, and the windows rattled slightly when the wind came down the ridge. I unpacked my things, lit a small fire in the stove, and tried to settle in. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, I realized after lying awake for hours. There was no sound of insects, no rustle of animals, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against the cabin walls. I chalked it up to being out in the wilderness and went to sleep. It started on the second night. I was half awake when I heard a faint scratching at the window. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, coming from the direction of the porch. My heart rate accelerated. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the glass, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, not random like a tree moving in the wind. I stayed under the covers until dawn. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. They were barefoot, long, narrow, and stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. I felt a chill I couldn't explain. I took photos and texted my cousin back in the city, but I got no response that day. The third night, I heard whispering. At first, it was too faint to make out. I thought it was the wind, shifting through the trees. But then I distinctly heard my name, drawn out in sing-song. Eli, Eli. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I bolted upright in bed, straining to hear more. The whispering faded, replaced by a low, scraping sound circling the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. During the day, I tried to distract myself by exploring the surrounding forest. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and roots exposed like the bones of the earth. I followed the creek upstream and found old foundations, moss-covered stones, remnants of a settlement that had likely been abandoned decades ago. As I ventured deeper, I felt the forest watching me. Every rustle, every crack of a branch seemed calculated. I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows that didn't belong, shapes that vanished when I turned to look. The fourth night was worse. The wind picked up early, whistling through the trees in a way that sounded almost human. The scraping at the cabin grew louder, accompanied by a slow knocking on the door. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying not to breathe. The knocking stopped, then resumed, 3 deliberate raps followed by silence. Then came the whisper again, my name, closer this time, almost right outside the window. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a small bag and planned to leave at first light. But when I tried to start my car, the battery was dead. My phone, which had been getting a weak signal, now showed no service, no matter where I stood. I was trapped. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and sleeplessness. The footsteps continued nightly, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping as if listening, sometimes dragging along the siding. Objects inside the cabin shifted when I wasn't looking. The kitchen knife I kept on the counter would appear on the table. Chairs would be slightly moved, as if someone or something had been sitting there. One afternoon, I decided to hike down the gravel road toward the nearest town. I thought if I could just reach someone, I could get help or at least figure out what was happening. I walked for hours, the forest pressing in tighter with each step. The road seemed longer than it should have been, twisting and turning, looping back on itself. I began to hear faint whistling behind me. At first I thought it was someone else on the road, but when I turned, there was no one. The whistling grew louder, higher pitched, almost mocking. I ran. Eventually, I found the road leading to a main highway and managed to flag down a truck. The driver didn't ask questions. He dropped me off in the next town, and I didn't look back. Even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. At night, when the wind blows just right, I hear it again, the faint 4-note whistle carried on the breeze calling my name. I've learned to ignore it, to stay inside, to never venture back to those mountains. Sometimes I dream of the cabin. In the dreams, the forest is darker, the shadows deeper. The figure I glimpsed on that fourth night stands at the edge of the clearing, featureless and still, watching. And I wake up with the smell of wet earth and rust in my nose, the echo of the whistle in my ears, and the certainty that the mountains remember. I've never returned to Black Hollow, and I never will. I warn anyone who dares to go. The woods are not empty, and the silence is not peace. The mountains keep their own, and once they notice you, it doesn't matter how far you run. Story the end. The first time I set foot in the Appalachian Mountains as an adult, I thought I was prepared. I had grown up in the shadow of these ridges, hiking their trails as a kid, swimming in their creeks, and listening to the whispered stories my grandmother told me about the strange things that lived in the woods. But no amount of childhood wonder or small-town folklore could prepare me for what I would encounter that late summer. I had taken a leave from my job in Charlotte to visit my uncle's old cabin near a remote part of North Carolina. He had passed a few months prior, leaving the cabin to me, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to reconnect with the mountains and do some writing. My uncle had always been a recluse, living in those woods for over 40 years. He claimed the isolation helped him see things the world ignored, though I had always assumed he just liked the quiet. Now, standing at the end of a narrow gravel road that twisted and climbed through dense forest, I understood exactly what he meant. The mountains had a way of swallowing you whole, of bending the senses and making even familiar terrain feel alien. The cabin itself sat on a plateau, surrounded by thick hardwoods and with a steep drop to a creek below. It was rustic, wooden, and weather-worn, with a sagging porch and a chimney that had not seen a fire in months. I parked my car and took a moment to just breathe, taking in the smell of wet earth and pine, the distant roar of a waterfall somewhere unseen. For a moment, everything was peaceful. That peace didn't last long. By the time I had unpacked, the sun was slipping behind the mountains, leaving long shadows stretching across the cabin. I built a fire in the fireplace and sat in one of the old chairs, thinking about how the mountains had always been a part of me, yet how little I truly knew them. My uncle's cabin had been off the grid for years, relying on a small generator and a rainwater system. The isolation that once seemed charming now carried a weight of tension I hadn't felt in years. Night fell quickly. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive, but sleep was fitful. I kept hearing noises, a branch snapping, the brush rustling, the faint sound of a footstep on the porch. At first, I told myself it was deer, raccoons, or some other animal common to the area. But as the hours passed, the noises grew deliberate. Footsteps pacing, scratches along the side of the cabin, low guttural murmurs that seemed almost human but impossible to place. I tried to rationalize, but an unease settled deep in my chest. The next morning, I set out to hike a trail my uncle had once told me about, a path that led deep into the forest and supposedly ended at a waterfall hidden in a narrow gorge. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push through thick underbrush, the path marked only by faded paint on trees and cairns of stones my uncle had stacked. As I walked, I noticed signs that something larger than human had passed through recently. Broken branches at a height that suggested a very tall creature. Massive footprints pressed into the soft earth, the claw-like gouges in trees that seemed far too deliberate for an animal acting out of instinct. By mid-afternoon, I was aware I had wandered farther than intended. The creek that was supposed to guide me toward the waterfall had disappeared, replaced by a dense thicket of laurel and hickory. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail seemed to twist on itself, confusing in ways that made no sense. Then I heard it. A low, deep growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It wasn't the growl of a bear or mountain lion. It carried intelligence, an almost deliberate intent that made my skin crawl. Panic set in. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping my face. When I reached a clearing, I froze. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs and eyes that seemed hollow and black, reflecting no light. It didn't move, didn't breathe audibly, but I could feel its gaze pressing down on me, like the forest itself had taken form and was watching. I dropped to the ground, crawling backward, trying to keep my eyes on it, and when I finally scrambled upright, it was gone. I eventually found my way back to the cabin at dusk, drenched, bleeding from scratches and covered in dirt. I locked the doors and windows and sat by the fire, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My rational mind told me it was fear and imagination, but something deep in my gut knew otherwise. Whatever was out there was real, and it had been aware of me, studying me. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The forest seemed to close in, the trees forming shapes that weren't there when I looked away. At night, I would hear footsteps circling the cabin, low growls, whispers that carried no words but filled me with dread. I began to leave small traps and markers around the cabin to monitor movement, but every morning I found signs that something had moved them. Large prints in the mud, branches broken, stones displaced. On the fourth night, the storm rolled in. Rain pelted the roof, wind howled through the trees, and I saw it for the first time near the cabin, stepping out from the edge of the woods. Its limbs were long, unnaturally bent, and it moved with a predatory grace. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lightning that split the sky. I grabbed my uncle's old rifle, but I didn't fire. Part of me knew there was no point. Whatever it was, it didn't fear guns, didn't fear humans. It existed on a different plane, one the mountains controlled. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, standing outside, watching, waiting. I thought of leaving in the morning, but the storm made the dirt road nearly impassable. I was trapped, and in the mountain darkness, I understood that the forest was not empty. It had never been empty. The next day, I attempted to hike back to the nearest road. I followed the creek, hoping it would lead me to civilization, but the landscape seemed to have changed overnight. Trees I had passed yesterday were no longer there. Rocks had shifted, the trail twisted unnaturally. Then I heard it again, a deep, resonant growl, followed by the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but the forest seemed endless. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing by the side of the creek. For hours, I sat there, listening to the forest move, realizing that the mountains themselves were alive in some way, and they were aware of my presence. When night fell, I made a decision. I would attempt to drive down the mountain no matter the road conditions, no matter the storm. I returned to the cabin, packed the few supplies I had, and started my descent. The headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, and I could feel eyes on me, following every turn, watching my every move. Halfway down the mountain, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, a tall, dark figure standing on the ridge, unmoving, eyes glowing faintly. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and when I looked again, it had vanished. By the time I reached the town at the base of the mountain, my hands were shaking, and I could barely speak to the locals about what I had seen. Some dismissed me as a city man spooked by the storm. Others nodded knowingly, muttering about the old ways and the things that live in the high woods. One old man, sitting at the counter of the diner, leaned toward me and said, "You don't understand. They've always been there. The mountains keep their own, and you, son, just happened to notice." I left Pine Hollow the next morning, vowing never to return. But even now, years later, I dream of the Appalachian Mountains, the creak of trees, the rustle of leaves, the hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. I hear whispers in the wind, footsteps on the porch, scratches along the cabin walls, and I know that the mountains are patient. They wait. Even from miles away, I can feel it sometimes, a pressure in the air, a weight that tells me I'm still being watched. I never speak of it because who would believe me? And yet, I know it is true. The Appalachians are alive, and they do not forgive intruders. Story the end. I grew up near the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, so I knew the mountains well, or at least I thought I did. My family had cabins scattered through the hollows and ridges, and I spent more weekends in the woods than I did in school. By the time I was 29, I had moved to Charlotte, worked a dead-end job in IT, and spent every spare weekend planning my escapes back to the mountains. I thought I knew what solitude in the Appalachians meant. I was wrong. It started on a crisp October Friday. I left the city at dawn, packing only the essentials, my backpack, some food, a tent, and a flashlight. I wanted to hike alone for 3 days, to clear my head and sleep under the stars. I drove north, leaving the highway behind around Marion, and began climbing the old gravel roads that wound up into the Pisgah National Forest. The air smelled like pine and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that sinks into your lungs and doesn't let go. I parked near an old trailhead I'd used years before, where a wooden sign, half rotted and leaning, read, "Ridge Trail, 1.8 miles. I shouldn't have taken it. Something in the way the trees bent over the trail, creating shadows before the sun was even high, felt wrong, but I ignored it. I thought it was just me, nerves from being alone for so long. The hike started normally. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, a thin breeze moved the tops of the trees, and the forest seemed alive in the way it always did. Birds called, and somewhere in the distance, a deer leapt over a fallen log. I reached the first clearing mid-morning where the trail split in two. Normally I'd take the left path, it led toward a ridge I liked to camp on, but for some reason I took the right. I have no idea why. It felt like instinct. Within an hour the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. Roots twisted across the trail like snakes. The air grew colder, even though the sun was still high. The path disappeared into shadows, and I realized I had no idea where I was. I tried to backtrack, but the way I had come seemed different. The landmarks weren't the same. A fallen tree that had been on the left was now on the right. A boulder that had marked a small creek was gone. Panic started to creep in. I pressed on, hoping to find a familiar trail, but that was when I saw them. Circles, stone circles, like those I'd read about in old folklore books, but never seen in person. Each circle was perfect, maybe 8 feet across, made of smooth river stones stacked in small piles. There were 5 circles in a clearing that couldn't have been more than 30 yards wide. In the center of one lay a small pile of sticks and leaves, arranged carefully, almost like an altar. I felt my stomach tighten. I'd been in the woods long enough to know when something wasn't right, and this was it. I stepped closer, my foot crunching a dry leaf, and I thought I heard it then. A whisper, almost too soft to hear. I froze, straining, and then I heard it again, a low murmur that seemed to drift from the tree line around the clearing. I wasn't imagining it. My skin crawled. I wanted to run back the way I came, but every direction looked the same. Trees twisted around me, shadows stretching and bending unnaturally. I felt like I was in a living maze. Night came fast in those hollows. I tried to set up camp near the stone circles, convincing myself I'd leave at first light. But as soon as I sat down, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. I held my breath, listening, but couldn't pinpoint the direction. Every few minutes, a twig snapped under weight heavier than mine. My flashlight felt inadequate against the darkness that pressed in like water. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the trees, thin and pale. I thought it was a trick of my eyes at first. But it moved, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were watching me. I froze, wishing I had a weapon, anything. It didn't come closer, didn't make a sound, and then it vanished. I couldn't tell if it ran or simply dissolved into the shadows. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The forest seemed to hum, a low vibration under the earth, almost like breathing. Every time I thought I heard the figure again, I spun in place, flashlight in hand, heart hammering. The air smelled of wet leaves and something metallic. I started hearing more whispers, low murmurs weaving through the trees. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone carried a warning, a threat. The next morning, I decided I had to leave immediately. I tore down my makeshift camp and started moving, following what I thought was the trail back. But the forest didn't cooperate. Every ridge looked the same. Every clearing seemed to repeat itself. And then I realized something terrifying. The stone circles were following me. Not physically, of course, they didn't move. But I would round a bend in the trail and see one, then another, in the same clearing I had passed before. They multiplied, appearing where none should exist. I began to run. Leaves shredded my clothes, roots snatched at my boots, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't hear my own breathing, until my legs ached and I was certain I'd twisted an ankle, but the whispering never stopped. No matter which direction I ran, the forest seemed to close in, reshaping itself, making escape impossible. By dusk, I stumbled into another clearing. This one had a larger stone circle, maybe 10 feet across, and in the center was a pile of bones. Small animal bones at first glance, but some were larger. Human, I realized too late. I gagged and backed away. The whispers rose, louder now, almost chanting. The thin, pale figure appeared again at the edge of the trees, and this time there were more of them. Faces indistinct, pale and twisted, standing just beyond the shadows. They didn't move toward me, but the forest itself seemed to shift, closing the distance. I felt trapped, pressed in by both trees and specters. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush until I finally broke through to a familiar trailhead. The relief was immediate but short-lived. My backpack was gone, my flashlight dead, and the air felt charged with something hostile. I didn't stop running until I reached the gravel road where I had parked my car. The headlights illuminated the path, but the trees were unnaturally dark, stretching toward me like claws. I jumped into my truck and drove without looking back, tires crunching over the gravel. I never returned to that hollow. Friends ask me about the mountains, about camping, about those trips I used to take. I smile, tell them I stick to trails now, that I prefer state parks. But I can't shake the memories, the whispering, the stone circles, the pale figures standing in the shadows. Sometimes at night I dream of that hollow. I wake sweating, certain I hear the low hum of the forest, certain that the shapes are out there, waiting. I've read the old Appalachian legends, the tales of the hollow people, of spirits that guard the mountains and the forest. I always thought they were just stories, meant to scare children and tourists. But now, I know better. There's something in those mountains, something older than the settlers, older than the trees themselves, and I know, deep down, that it remembers me. Even years later, I won't go near that hollow. I don't speak its name. And when I close my eyes, I sometimes hear the whispering, soft and patient, carrying the promise that the mountains always have their secrets, and sometimes they follow you home. Story the end. I arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in late May, when the air was thick with humidity and the forest seemed to pulse with life. I was 24, exhausted from city life and looking for a place to disappear for the summer. My cousin had given me the number for a man named Paul, who rented out a small cabin near a town called Hollow Ridge. The cabin was cheap, isolated, and rustic, exactly what I thought I needed to write my novel. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that twisted around ridges, with trees pressing so close you could barely see the sky. When I finally turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, I realized it wasn't maintained. Tire ruts disappeared under layers of moss and fallen leaves, and the underbrush had begun to creep into the road itself. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the ridge, and shadows pooled thick and dark across the clearing. The cabin itself was small, a single story with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged under its own weight. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and mildew, with faint traces of smoke from a fire long dead. The furniture was sparse, 2 chairs, a sagging couch, a rough-hewn table, and everything creaked as I moved. The windows rattled when the wind blew down the ridge, which Paul assured me was just the mountains settling. The first night was uneventful. I ate a simple dinner, lit a fire in the stove, and listened to the forest as night fell. The silence was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, but I told myself it was just the isolation I had been seeking. On the second night, I heard it. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the cabin. Then I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate, a soft scraping along the side of the building, moving from the back to the front. My heart rate spiked and I froze, straining to hear more. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But when I stepped outside at dawn to investigate, I found footprints. Barefoot, long, narrow, and uneven, leading from the woods to the porch and stopping abruptly. I called Paul, but all he said was, "Don't go outside if you hear anything at night. And whatever you do, don't answer when they call your name." I laughed, but his voice had an edge I didn't like. The following days were a haze of fear and tension. During the day, I explored the trails near the cabin, trying to understand the forest. The trees were ancient, twisted, and gnarled, their roots breaking the soil like bones. The creek nearby ran cold and clear, cutting a silver line through the shadows. I found old stone foundations and rusted tools, remnants of cabins long abandoned. Every time I looked around, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in, as if unseen eyes were watching my every move. Nights became unbearable. The scraping at the walls returned, accompanied by whispering voices. Sometimes I heard my name drawn out sing-song, carried on the wind, Eli, Eli. My blood ran cold every time. I stayed inside, doors locked, curtains drawn, trying to ignore the sounds, but sleep became impossible. On the 5th night, the wind came down the ridge like a living thing. It whistled through the trees, high and low, carrying words I couldn't understand. Then came footsteps, circling the cabin, deliberate and heavy. I crouched in a corner with a kitchen knife, heart hammering in my chest, trying not to breathe. A shadow passed across the wall, elongated and impossible, and I realized whatever it was, it didn't belong to the natural world. The 6th night was worse. I woke to the sound of scratching on the windows, louder than ever, accompanied by a low, guttural whisper. The voice called my name again, but this time it was deeper, almost monstrous. I pressed myself against the wall, shivering. The sound of movement circled the cabin, dragging along the siding, climbing across the roof, pausing just above my head. Then silence. Morning came, but relief did not. Outside, I found more footprints in the mud, hundreds of them, circling the cabin, overlapping, leading into the woods. The forest seemed to have shifted overnight. Trees that had been far away now seemed close. The path to the road twisting in ways it hadn't before. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed a small bag and tried to start the car. The battery was dead. My phone, which had shown a weak signal during the day, now displayed no service no matter where I moved. I was trapped. I considered walking down the road to find help, but the forest seemed alive, reshaping itself, closing paths and guiding me back to the cabin. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me, watching, following. Branches scratched at my skin, roots tangled my feet, and distant whispers urged me toward the trees, toward the shadows. I waited until the 7th night, hoping for a break in the storm or a chance to escape. That night, the wind roared down the ridge, shaking the cabin to its foundations. The whistling returned, louder, more insistent, and the footsteps grew in number and intensity. I could hear them circling, climbing, scratching. The voices called my name, sometimes in chorus, sometimes alone, all around me. I crouched in the corner, clutching my knife, praying for dawn. Hours passed. Then, in the darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly pale, emerged from the tree line. Its face was featureless except for a thin slit where the mouth should have been. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, tilting its head as if studying me. My stomach turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then it vanished, as silently as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of wind and the faintest smell of rust and wet earth. Morning came, but nothing had changed outside. The cabin stood, the forest loomed, and the footprints in the mud remained. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed what I could carry and started down the gravel road, following the faint outline of tire tracks, praying they led to the main highway. Hours later, I stumbled onto the road and was lucky enough to flag down a truck. The driver didn't ask questions, and I didn't answer. I didn't look back. Even now, months later, I can hear it in my dreams. The whistling, the scraping, the voices calling my name. I moved far, far from the Appalachians, but sometimes when the wind picks up just right, I swear I can feel those eyes in the trees, and I know the mountains remember me. Story. The end. The first thing I noticed when I drove into the Appalachian Mountains was how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet you get when you're in the suburbs at night with distant traffic and the hum of neon signs, but the kind of quiet that presses in on you, fills the spaces between the trees, and makes your own heartbeat sound like a jackhammer. I had grown up near the lower ridges of the Appalachians, spent my childhood scrambling over rocks and swimming in the creeks, but I hadn't realized how different it felt deeper in, where the towns were few and the mountains thick. I was heading to a cabin my uncle had left me, a small wooden structure perched on the side of a ridge near a place called Red Hollow. My uncle had always been a recluse, living up there for decades, and when he passed, he left the cabin to me with a note that simply read, "Keep your eyes open." I had laughed at it back then, thinking he was just being quirky. Now, driving up the narrow, winding road in my old truck, I wasn't laughing. The road deteriorated quickly as I climbed. Asphalt gave way to gravel, which in turn gave way to dirt and roots. I drove cautiously, gripping the wheel tightly as the truck bounced over uneven ground. Trees leaned close on either side, forming a tunnel of green that blocked most of the fading afternoon light. Somewhere far above, the sun was setting, painting the clouds a dull, fiery red. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was almost dark. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits: weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a stone chimney that smelled faintly of smoke, even though it hadn't been used in months. I parked the truck and stepped out, the smell of wet leaves and moss filling my nose. The forest seemed alive, almost aware of me, though I tried to tell myself it was just the usual wildlife. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something metallic I couldn't place. I unpacked my bag and started a fire, the flames throwing long shadows across the walls. I wanted to write, to make sense of the mountains and their pull, but my mind kept wandering to the stories my uncle had told me as a kid, the stories of people disappearing in the woods, of strange creatures that moved through the trees at night. At the time, I thought they were just tales to scare a child. Now, alone in the dark, I wasn't so sure. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of leaves outside the cabin made me tense. Around midnight, I swore I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening. The steps stopped. I convinced myself it was a deer or raccoon, and eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. But when I woke hours later, the door was slightly ajar. I had locked it before bed. The next day, I decided to explore. I followed a trail my uncle had shown me years ago, one that led deeper into the hollows and eventually to a series of small waterfalls. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push through thick brush and dodge fallen logs. As I walked, I noticed signs that something large had passed through recently: broken branches at a height well above my head, footprints that were too long and wide to be human, and claw marks on tree trunks. My rational mind struggled to dismiss it as bear or elk, but the pattern and spacing of the prints suggested something else entirely. By the time I reached the largest waterfall, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, and a heavy fog was rolling in. I turned to head back, but the trail no longer looked familiar. The creek that should have guided me was obscured by thick ferns and shadows, and the landmarks I remembered from childhood were gone. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended, and panic began to creep in. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions. I froze, straining my ears. The growl was followed by movement in the trees, a swaying, deliberate motion. I stepped back, my heart hammering. And then I saw it, a figure emerging from the mist, taller than any human, limbs unnaturally long, moving with a grace that was both fluid and predatory. Its eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, hollow and black. I stumbled backward, falling over roots and rocks, and when I looked again, the figure had vanished. I ran. I don't remember the path exactly, only that I was desperate to reach the safety of the cabin. Branches whipped my face and my clothes were torn, but I didn't stop. When I finally burst into the clearing where the cabin sat, I collapsed on the porch, gasping and shaking. The forest seemed to watch me, silent and oppressive. For the next several days, I stayed inside, too terrified to venture out. I barricaded the doors, checked the locks obsessively, and tried to convince myself that whatever I had seen was a hallucination born of fear and exhaustion. But every night, the noises returned. Scratches along the walls, footsteps circling the cabin, whispers in a language I didn't understand. One night, I even saw shadows moving outside the windows, long limbs stretching across the walls, and heard my name whispered in a voice that was both familiar and alien. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in. Rain pelted the roof and wind howled through the trees. That was when I saw it again. It was at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by trees, watching me with those hollow eyes. I grabbed my uncle's old rifle, shaking, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever it was, it did not fear humans. It existed on a different plane, something the mountains had kept hidden for centuries. I spent the next day trying to descend the mountain, hoping to reach a town or at least a main road. The storm had turned the dirt track into mud, and progress was slow. Halfway down, I saw it again, standing on a ridge, watching me, unmoving. I swerved the truck, narrowly avoiding a tree, and when I looked back, it was gone. By the time I reached the town at the base of the mountains, I was shaken to my core. I tried to speak to the locals about what I had seen, but most dismissed me as a city man spooked by the storm. One old man, sitting at the counter of a diner, leaned in and whispered, "You don't understand. They've always been there. The mountains keep their own, and you, son, just happened to notice." I never returned to that part of the mountains, but even now, years later, I dream of Red Hollow. I hear footsteps circling the cabin, scratches on the walls, and hollow eyes in the dark. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling the weight of the mountains pressing in, and I know that whatever I saw is still out there, patient, waiting for the next fool to wander too far from the safety of the path. The Appalachians are alive in ways most people can't understand. They watch, they wait, and if you're unlucky enough to notice them, they will follow. Story, the end. It was the fall of 2018 when I first went into the Appalachian Mountains alone, and it was supposed to be the perfect escape. And I had just turned 30, tired of city life in Atlanta, tired of the fluorescent lights, the constant traffic, and the relentless noise. My plan was simple. Drive up to a cabin tucked deep in the Pisgah National Forest, spend 3 days hiking and camping, and leave my phone off the entire time. I wanted isolation, quiet, and a chance to breathe without the weight of the city pressing on me. I left Atlanta early on a Friday morning. The highways were empty, and the air felt different the moment I crossed into North Carolina. By mid-afternoon, I had turned off the main roads and was following a gravel path that wound steeply up the mountain. The trees were thick, their branches tangled overhead, and the smell of pine and wet leaves filled the air. I hadn't realized how much I needed this until I stepped out of my truck at the trailhead, feeling the cool air against my face. The trailhead was unmarked, with only a faded wooden sign that read, "Ridge Trail, 2.5 miles. I had hiked it before in my 20s, but I hadn't been back in years. The trail began gently, winding through hardwoods, the forest floor covered in a thick carpet of leaves. Birds called occasionally, and the wind rustled the treetops, making patterns of light and shadow. I kept moving, listening, trying to ignore the nagging sense that I was being watched. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing I remembered from before. It was open and sunny, with a few large boulders scattered about. But something felt off. The clearing had changed. In the center were stones stacked in perfect circles, each circle a foot or two across, smooth and round. At first I thought maybe someone had been here recently, a camper or a hiker with too much time on their hands. But the arrangement was too deliberate, too precise. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I took pictures with my phone, even though there was no signal. Something about the place made me uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I set up my small tent at the edge of the clearing and tried to relax. Night fell quickly in the mountains, shadows stretching long and dark. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first sound, a snap of a branch somewhere beyond the clearing. I froze, listening. Then another snap, and another, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were deliberate, slow, circling around the clearing. My stomach twisted as I realized the sound seemed to be moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but saw nothing. The forest went silent again, heavy and oppressive, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed awake most of the night, heart pounding, listening to the subtle noises of the woods, a rustling in the leaves, a distant snap of a twig, the occasional hoot of an owl. But underneath it all, there was something else. A low, steady hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the earth and through me. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The stone circles were still there, and now I noticed small piles of rocks near my tent, arranged like the ones in the clearing. I hadn't left my tent at all during the night. I packed quickly and tried to find the trail leading back down, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Landmarks I recognized were gone. The fallen log I used as a marker was in a different place, and a boulder I passed on the way up was missing. I tried to stay calm and pressed on, following what I thought was the right direction. Hours passed. The trail twisted unnaturally, bending back on itself. I kept seeing the stone circles, always just ahead, as if the forest itself was guiding me, or trapping me. I began to feel dizzy, disoriented. Shadows stretched and moved in ways that didn't make sense, and I started hearing voices whispering in a language I didn't know. The whispers were soft but urgent, repeating the same unintelligible phrases over and over. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a larger clearing. There were more stone circles here, at least a dozen, arranged in concentric patterns. In the center of the largest circle was a pile of sticks and bones. Some were small animal bones, but others were unmistakably human. I gagged and stumbled back, heart racing. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting, and the thin, pale figure I had glimpsed earlier appeared at the edge of the clearing. Its face was indistinct, shadowed, and I could feel its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on me. I turned and ran blindly, crashing through underbrush and roots, my flashlight bouncing wildly. Branches scratched my arms, and I twisted my ankle, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed, circling, always just beyond the light. I felt as though the forest itself was alive, reshaping itself to keep me inside. Every trail I thought I knew became unfamiliar. Every ridge and boulder shifted position. Time lost all meaning. The sun dipped low, and I realized I would have to spend another night in these woods. I found a small hollow between two ridges and collapsed, exhausted. I tried to stay awake, telling myself that sleep would mean death. But the whispers became a song, low and melodic, pulling me toward the stone circles. I resisted, pressing my hands to my ears. The figure appeared again, pale and thin, standing motionless, watching. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I don't know. When dawn finally broke, the forest seemed normal again. The stone circles were gone, and the trail looked like the one I remembered from before. I limped down the mountain, sun rising behind me, until I finally reached the gravel road and my truck. I drove for hours, never looking back, heart hammering, convinced that the forest was following me even beyond the mountains. Back in Atlanta, I tried to explain what happened to friends. Most didn't believe me, laughed it off as exhaustion or imagination, but I knew what I saw. The stone circles, the pale figures, the voices, the shifting trails, they weren't imagined. Whatever I encountered in those hollows wasn't human, and it wasn't benign. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the low hum, the whispers echoing in my ears, and I feel those eyes on me, just beyond the trees, waiting. I never went back to the Appalachian Mountains. I never will. The forest has its secrets, and some of them don't like to be disturbed. Some of them remember. Story the end. The summer I turned 30, I decided to take a trip back to the Appalachian Mountains, to the part of western North Carolina where I had grown up. I'd spent most of my adult life in Charlotte, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and fluorescent lights, and I'd forgotten what real quiet sounded like. When I first pulled off the highway onto the narrow, twisting roads that led up into the mountains, I felt it immediately. The weight of the woods, the way the trees leaned together to block the sky, and the thick, damp smell of earth and moss. I was heading to my uncle's cabin, a place I hadn't visited in over a decade. He had lived alone up there for decades, and when he passed away unexpectedly, he left the cabin to me with no explanation, just a key and a note that read, "Take care of what you find." I didn't know what he meant at the time, but now, sitting in my truck and staring up at the ridge where the cabin waited, I began to feel a twinge of unease. The road grew worse as I ascended, from cracked asphalt to gravel to a dirt track carved into the side of the mountain. The trees pressed in on either side of the vehicle, their long limbs arching like cathedral beams. Sunlight filtered in patches, and shadows moved in ways that felt off. Somewhere above me, a hawk cried, its voice startlingly loud in the silence. The closer I got to the cabin, the quieter the world seemed to become. The cabin was exactly as I remembered, weathered, gray, with a sagging porch and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in months. I parked and stepped out, the forest floor crunching under my boots. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet leaves and rotting wood. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside, noting the familiar smell of old pine and dust. It was as though my uncle had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. I started a fire in the stone fireplace, though I could hear the wind rattling the windows. That night, sleep did not come easily. I kept hearing noises, footsteps on the porch, scratches along the walls, the soft scuff of something moving just outside the window. Each time I would tell myself it was wildlife, raccoons, maybe even a bear, but the sounds were too deliberate. They paused and shifted as if considering me, learning me. Around midnight, I thought I saw a shadow move outside, tall and narrow, but when I blinked, it was gone. I tried to shake it off as imagination, fatigue, or the natural eeriness of the mountains at night. The next morning, I decided to hike a trail my uncle had once shown me, one that led deep into the forest and supposedly to a waterfall hidden in a narrow gorge. The trail was overgrown in parts, the markers faded or missing entirely, and I realized how little I actually knew about the forest that had once seemed so familiar. I pushed on, brushing past laurel and rhododendron, stepping over fallen trees and loose rocks. It was hot and humid, and the thick canopy made the light dappled and confusing. After about an hour, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints, far too large to be human, pressed into the soft soil, moving off the trail into the woods. They were spaced in a way that suggested an unnatural stride, and deeper impressions, like claw marks, marred the ground in several places. I felt a chill despite the heat, but I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a large black bear, though nothing about the spacing or shape fit. As I moved deeper, the forest seemed to close in. The creek that was supposed to guide me was no longer visible, swallowed by underbrush. Branches broke overhead, and I thought I heard something moving behind me. I turned quickly, catching a glimpse of a tall, thin figure with limbs that seemed too long, eyes dark and hollow, just at the edge of the mist that had begun to rise. I froze. My rational mind screamed to run, but my body was caught in place. Then the figure shifted, like it was gliding over the forest floor, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I ran. I don't remember the path, only that I stumbled through brush and roots, branches, tearing my clothes, my lungs burning. The figure moved with me, always just at the edge of my vision, never fully visible, but always there. I tripped over a root and fell into a patch of ferns, panting, terrified. When I got up, I realized I had reached a small clearing where sunlight barely penetrated. The figure was gone, but I felt its gaze, the oppressive weight of something ancient and intelligent. I returned to the cabin by dusk, exhausted and shaken. The forest outside seemed almost silent now, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. I boarded up the windows and doors, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was a trick of the light, or stress, or hallucination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something lived in those mountains, something that had been there long before humans arrived, and that would remain long after we were gone. The nights became worse. Scratches along the walls, footprints in the mud surrounding the cabin, low growls and whispers that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. One night I saw shadows flitting across the porch, stretching and bending in impossible ways. I grabbed my uncle's rifle, though I knew it would not matter. Whatever it was, it did not fear bullets or humans. It was patient, intelligent, and ancient. By the fourth night, I realized I could not stay. I packed hastily and decided to drive down the mountain despite the muddy, storm-soaked road. The headlights of the truck barely penetrated the fog and sheets of rain, and I felt the sense of being watched the entire way down. Halfway to the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. On a ridge above me, a figure stood, impossibly tall, eyes faintly glowing, unmoving. I swerved and nearly lost control, heart pounding. When I looked again, it was gone. I reached the town at the base of the mountain before dawn, shaking and exhausted. I tried to tell the locals, but most just smiled politely, muttering something about the storms and the mountains. An old man in a diner leaned in and said, "Son, you saw them because you were meant to. They've always been here, watching. The mountains take care of their own." Years have passed since that trip, but I still dream of Red Hollow. I hear footsteps circling in my dreams, scratches along the walls, and feel eyes watching me in the dark. Even now, the weight of the mountains presses in when I close my eyes. I know that whatever I saw is still out there, patient, waiting for the next person to wander too far into the woods. The Appalachian Mountains are alive in ways most people cannot comprehend. They watch, they wait. And if you ever find yourself deep in the hollows alone, you may notice them too. If you do, remember, the mountains are patient and they do not forgive intrusion. Story the end. It was late October when I decided to take a solo trip into the Appalachian Mountains. I had spent months in Atlanta working 12-hour shifts surrounded by fluorescent lights and the constant hum of computers, and I needed to get away. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the Pisgah National Forest near Boone, North Carolina. The listing boasted of isolation. No cell service, barely any electricity, and a winding gravel road that led up into the mountains. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, quiet, and a chance to breathe without the weight of the city pressing down on me. I left at dawn on a Friday, the sun just brushing the tops of the mountains as I headed north. The highway gave way to winding country roads, which eventually narrowed into gravel paths flanked by thick forest. The scent of pine and damp leaves filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of the mountains. The further I went, the more the world seemed to recede until it was just me and the mountains. By mid-afternoon, I reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense trees. The cabin itself was rustic, a wide porch that wrapped around the front, a stone chimney, and weathered wooden walls. It was quiet, too quiet, but at first that felt comforting. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchenette, and a loft with a single mattress. Electricity worked, barely, and there was no signal on my phone. That was fine. I unpacked my things, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The mountains stretched in every direction, ridges layered on top of each other, their peaks fading into the pale blue sky. I felt a peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. As evening fell, I made a small fire in the wood stove and ate a simple dinner, listening to the forest settle into night. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees. By 10, the forest was dark and still. It was then I first heard it, a snapping of twigs somewhere beyond the clearing. I froze, listening. At first I thought it was a deer, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and close. It circled the cabin. My stomach twisted as I strained to see into the shadows. Nothing appeared. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, and eventually forced myself to sleep. Morning brought no relief. The air was colder, and the shadows in the clearing felt thicker. I decided to hike a trail that led behind the cabin. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, twisting through thick hardwoods. As I climbed, the forest became quieter. Birds were gone, the wind seemed muted, and the air smelled of wet leaves and moss. I came to a small creek and paused to refill my water bottle. The stones along the bank were unusually smooth and worn flat as if something heavy had passed over them repeatedly. I felt uneasy, but kept moving. After an hour, I stumbled onto a small clearing. At first, it looked like a normal forest opening, but then I saw it. A circle of stones arranged in perfect symmetry. Each stone was smooth and round, the size of a basketball, stacked into small pyramids. There were no footprints, no remnants of a fire, just the stones, arranged as if someone or something had done it intentionally. My chest tightened. I took a few pictures and moved on quickly, telling myself it was probably an old ritual site, something locals had made years ago. That night, the footsteps returned, louder, closer, circling the cabin. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, listening as something moved deliberately through the underbrush. Then I heard it. A low hum, soft at first, vibrating through the air and the ground beneath me. It was hypnotic, chilling, and I couldn't identify its source. I held my breath, straining, but the sound grew louder, surrounding me, pressing against my mind. I wanted to leave, to run, but exhaustion pinned me to the bed. The following day, I tried to shake off the fear with a longer hike. I climbed higher into the mountains, seeking a ridge I knew from past visits. The forest grew colder, denser. The shadows stretched long and unnatural. I came across another clearing, this one larger, filled with more stone circles, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. In the center of the largest circle lay a pile of sticks and bones. Some were small, animal-sized, but others were unmistakably human. My stomach turned. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A figure at the edge of the clearing, pale and thin, standing motionless among the trees. It watched me. I couldn't move. Its face was indistinct, shadowed, but its presence radiated something ancient and malevolent. Then, without warning, it disappeared, dissolving into the darkness of the forest as if it had never been there. I ran blindly, crashing through roots and branches until I reached what I thought was a familiar trail. The forest seemed to warp around me, reshaping itself. Every ridge looked the same. Every boulder seemed to shift. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours. Night fell again before I could find a safe spot. I collapsed in a hollow, pressing myself against the earth, too afraid to sleep but too exhausted to stay fully awake. The whispers started, low and melodic, repeating themselves in a language I didn't know. The figure appeared again at the edge of my vision, pale and patient. I forced myself to stay awake, trembling, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The forest seemed to reset with the sunrise. The stone circles were gone, the trail looked familiar, and the air no longer hummed. I limped down the mountain, sun behind me, until I reached the gravel road and my truck. I drove for hours, never looking back, heart hammering, convinced the forest was still watching me. Even after I returned to the city, the memory didn't fade. I dream about those clearings, the stone circles, the pale figure standing in the shadows. Sometimes I wake at night, hearing the low hum or faint whispers in the darkness. I never went back to the mountains, and I never will. I know now that there are places in the Appalachians that are older than any of us, older than the settlers, older than the forest itself. They remember you once you've entered, and they wait. Story the end.